So what is this epic that I think is coming to an end? Very briefly, led by the United States, the policies and institutions that far-sighted statesmen put in place after World War II enabled Europe and Japan to rise from the ashes of war, embrace democracy, and preside over the greatest period of peace and broad-based prosperity in human history. It is the viability of the post-World War II order that is now in doubt. The Great Recession shattered complacent assumptions on both sides of the Atlantic. And in East Asia, 2 decades of economic stagnation exacerbated by demographic decline have left the Japanese wondering about their future as a country. During the 1920s and 1930s, the failure of market economies and democratic political institutions boosted the credibility of totalitarian governance and central economic planning. Today, after the Great Recession has eroded the credibility of what was once known as the Washington Consensus, the startling rise of China and the stunning success of entities such as Singapore offer alternative models of state capitalism decoupled from democratic self-government. As a result, in my judgment, the West has become uncertain of its future. At first glance, this mood reflects the economic situation. But, and this is one of the crucial points in my overall argument, the centrality of economic well-being in our politics reflects long-held assumptions about the purposes of our politics. If economic growth and shared prosperity are in jeopardy, so are our political arrangements. What are these arrangements? Well, what I'll call the liberal democratic bargain defined the era that began in 1945. The terms of this bargain were straightforward. Working with technical experts, bureaucrats, economists, and the like, popularly elected governments would deliver economic growth with steady reductions in poverty, rising living standards for all, expanding physical and economic security, and not the least, healthcare that increases longevity and works towards the age-old Enlightenment dream of defeating death itself. In return, the public would give experts and political leaders a substantial measure of deference and trust. For decades, that bargain held, and public support for liberal democracy and its leaders and its experts remained high. More recently, however, economic events have called into question the ability of elites to fulfill their side of the bargain, and public confidence has waned. For some, and I would say for some few, liberal democracy may be an intrinsic good and end in itself. For the majority, however, it is a means to peaceful, commodious, ever-progressing lives. It is, in short, a tree known by its fruit. If it ceases to produce the expected crop, all bets are off. Well, what about the crop? What does the harvest look like recently? For much of Europe, the past decade has been marked by economic stagnation and stubbornly high unemployment, which today remains above 11% in the 19 members of the Eurozone. In response, populist revolts have broken out at both ends of the political spectrum, and the long-standing dominance of center-left, center-right parties is being challenged, with the interesting exception of Germany, which we may want to discuss later. On the surface, the United States is doing better. After a deep downturn, modest growth resumed in mid-2009. About 12 million new jobs have been created, and unemployment has fallen by 5 full percentage points. But recall, overall aggregate growth is only part of the liberal democratic bargain. In the 6 years since the official end of the Great Recession, wage increases have barely kept up with inflation, and median household income remains well below its pre-recession level. The majority of unemployed workers who found new jobs are earning less than they did in their jobs prior to the recession. Relatively few jobs are now being created offer incomes in the middle range. The plurality are in the lower wage service sector, and most of the rest are in the high-skilled professions that require advanced training. As a result, median household income today is no higher than it was in the late 1990s. So from the standpoint of the middle class, they have experienced 16 wasted years of economic stagnation. And if you don't believe me, go out and talk to them. Standard measures of economic inequality reveal a substantial rise in recent decades. I'll restrain myself from responding to Professor Grieva's animadversions against the Gini coefficient, which is reasonably good social science, even if it can be, a counterproductive weapon of political rhetoric. The real point is this: the share of our national income going to wages and salaries is at its lowest point in nearly half a century, and the share of income and wealth commanded by the top 1% is at levels not seen since the late 1920s. Not surprisingly, here too, as in Europe, populist revolts have erupted at both ends of the political spectrum. The Tea Party on the right, the late Occupy movement on the left. While it's unlikely that figures such as Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders will win major party nominations, the surge of support they have enjoyed demonstrates the deep reservoir of public discontent into which they are tapping. Now, what does this mean? What are the moral and political stakes? I've already indicated what I think they are, but let me expand on them just a little bit. The distribution of economic surpluses is the business of normal politics in liberal democracies. The process is never free of conflict, but it is usually conducive to compromise. Political life is very different when growth slows or halts, and the challenge becomes the allocation of losses in a zero-sum environment. Human experience suggests, and behavioral economics confirms, that the pain of loss exceeds the pleasure of gain. Although failing to improve one's well-being is disappointing, losing what one has previously enjoyed is embittering, and many of the past pathologies that we see today are the consequences of this sentiment. In response, first comes the politics of blame. If something has gone wrong, someone else must be responsible. Wealthy malefactors, corrupt government officials, immigrants, even foreign conspirators. The search for scapegoats diverts attention from the real problems and impedes the development of effective solutions. The politics of blame provides fertile ground for demagogues who know how to play on people's hopes and fears, and their message is almost invariably some form of populism, and it goes like this: the people are virtuous, the elites are corrupt. We should set aside the useless, self-serving subtleties of experts and rely on the sturdy common sense of ordinary citizens. Donald Trump. When times are hard, the varied social and economic groups in modern politics struggle with one another, each striving to minimize its losses at the expense of others. Elected governments mirror these divisions, making it hard for them to act effectively. Temporizing and gridlock are the order of the day, further stoking public discontent. In the Europe of the 1930s, these phenomena led to contempt for parliamentary democracy and a willingness to consider non-democratic alternatives. Prominent intellectuals praised fascism, communism, even Nazism, not the least for their capacity to act boldly. Liberal democracy is more robust today than it was between the two world wars. Nonetheless, it is not hard to detect rising admiration for China's ability to mobilize resources for large purposes. In fact, the Chinese government can erect massive cities faster than U.S. officials can complete the required environmental impact studies. Well, how did we get here? Here's my answer, and it doesn't fit in very well with the politics of blame that is at the heart of the populist revolt. Briefly, I believe that the interplay of globalization and technological change fundamentally shifted the balance between labor and capital, setting in motion the slow erosion of the post-war middle class. What had been an occupational bell curve dominated by middle-wage, middle-skilled jobs shifted towards a more bifurcated pattern with larger shares of high-skilled professional and manufacturing workers at one end and lower-paid workers in retail, food, and personal services on the other. The Great Recession accelerated this process, but it began much earlier. And meanwhile, the now famous 1% was breaking away from the pack. The gap between the compensation of CEOs and the wages of their workers increased manyfold, and the expansion of the financial sector produced a cadre of innovators, speculators, traders, and managers that enjoys almost unimaginable wealth. The advertisements in the New York Times Sunday magazine convey some sense of how this new class spends its wealth, or should I say wastes it. Meanwhile, middle-class families have been treading water, and perhaps even more important, many parents fear that their children will do worse than they themselves have. There has been a profound loss of confidence in the future. Now, why does all of this matter? To repeat, I agree with Professor Grieve. You can't simply look at statistical tables of income distribution and read the goodness or badness of that distribution off them. You have to look at the way in which different distributions of income and wealth function in relation to things that we have very good reason to care about. And I think that's the most useful way to proceed. By contrast, many liberals and progressives believe that beyond a certain point, economic inequality is wrong per se. Many conservatives counter that even raising the question is wrong because it reflects envy and leads to class warfare. This argument can go on endlessly without reaching a useful conclusion. So let us, as Professor Grieve has already recommended, look at the consequences. What are the negative consequences of rising inequality? Here is my fourfold answer. Number one, in my reading of the evidence, beyond a certain point, economic inequality retards economic growth. Scott Winship and I have debated this on more than one occasion in the past year. I do not read the evidence exactly the way he does. I fully grant it is an empirical question, but I think we can agree that if it were the case that beyond a certain point, inequalities of wealth and income did retard economic growth, that would be a serious matter worth attending to. The second goal on which high and rising inequality has a negative impact is social mobility. And let me go on about this just a little bit longer. For a very long time, Americans believed that their ability to rise from modest circumstances to prosperity was higher than that of other advanced societies, counterbalancing their country's wider economic inequality. But recent research, in my judgment, tells a different story. And rather than going through all the statistics that I've assembled here, I may inflict them on you in the question and answer period if anybody challenges me. Let me simply say that I think the research of the past decade has established two propositions. Number one, social mobility in the United States today is actually measurably lower than in a number of European countries. And social mobility in the United States is certainly no higher than it was a generation ago and may actually be lower. So the story that Americans have told themselves, well, more inequality, but so what because we have more mobility, is, I believe, no longer true. We can have an interesting discussion as to when it ceased being true, but I believe it's no longer true. The third area where inequality matters is social cohesion. A healthy polity needs a degree of fellow feeling among its members, a sentiment that rests on shared experiences. The fabled greatest generation, now regrettably passing from the scene, endured the Depression and World War II together, generating a sense of solidarity that shaped American society and its politics for decades. In his latest book, the political scientist Robert Putnam vividly describes growing up in Port Clinton, Ohio in the 1950s. Regardless of differences in family background, the children in Port Clinton went to the same schools, engaged in the same activities, and socialized across what class lines there were. To be sure, the parents of the better off kids had bigger houses and better cars, but the differences were modest and produced neither geographical nor psychological difference. The dramatic rise of inequality in recent decades has turned this on its head. Despite whatever the equalizing tendencies of commodification may be, the well-to-do live in different neighborhoods, send their children to different schools, and take different kinds of vacations in different places. They identify more with their professions and their social peers than with their communities. Their children attend elite universities and rarely volunteer for military service. Many executives have more in common with their counterparts in other countries than with those of modest means in their own. This process, I would argue, has exacerbated not only social distance, but also political polarization. We're not yet Brazil, but in another generation or two, we could be there if we're not careful. The final area of concern is democratic stability, and this concern connects up with an argument that has been characteristic of the Western tradition of political philosophy since Aristotle, namely, stable and decent political societies rest on a large, secure middle class. A large, secure middle class in economic orders not riven by extremes of wealth and poverty. In the decades after World War II, just such a middle class emerged, first in the United States and then in Europe. In recent decades, however, this trend has gone into reverse. I've studied the United States most carefully, and I can report this with reasonable statistical certainty. As recently as 1970, middle-class households accounted for more than half the total households in the United States. Since 1970, the middle-class households as a share of total households has trended relentlessly downward. It's not just the statistical size of the middle class, but also its outlook. It's not only shrinking, but it is also far less secure than it once was. Coupled with stagnating incomes, the impact of rising costs, especially for higher education, has diminished middle-class parents' confidence in the future. Increasing numbers of those parents do not expect their children to live better than or even as well as they themselves do. These declining expectations challenge the basic ethos of post-war life in the United States, the American dream, and they've weakened trust and confidence in the institutions and leaders who were expected to sustain that dream, but in recent decades have manifestly failed to do so. So, to summarize, the four consequences I think are at stake in the inequality debate are economic growth, social mobility, social cohesion, and political stability. I now reach my conclusion. One may argue, as have some environmentalists and traditional conservatives, that all these difficulties can be traced back to the liberal democratic promise that popular governments can manage market economies so as to unleash unending, broadly shared material progress. Once that becomes the expectation, so the argument goes, periods of economic distress are bound to weaken public support, not just for markets, but for liberal democracy itself. But, they conclude, the flaw is in the expectations. There's some truth to this, but it is not a useful truth because there is no possibility of turning back to a pre-modern economy or to a pre-modern understanding of what human life requires and is about. I'm hardly the first to observe, and at the University of Dallas I need not drop footnotes, that at the core of what we call modernity is the legitimation of the very human desire for secure and commodious existence. Because nature offers at most the raw materials for such a life, realizing that desire requires the ceaseless employment of effort and ingenuity in the service of material improvement. And as Aristotle observes in the Politics, there is in principle no limit to such striving. And I quote the master, "The desire for life being unlimited, people also desire in unlimited amount what is conducive to life. Only conceptions of good lives, guided by higher purposes, can limit boundless material striving in principle, and only lives shaped by such conceptions can make these limits effective in practice. Warriors who prize courage and loyalty are less concerned with material acquisition. So too are scholars who seek truth, and, of course, pious individuals who seek God." But democracies have a hard time defining moral limits. Not just modern democracies, all democracies, and in principle. And here's why. There's an inherent link between democracy and liberty between liberty and diversity. Social norms and political institutions are needed, of course, to secure peaceful coexistence amidst this diversity, but these norms are not of the sort that would be needed to limit desire at its root. Democracy, in the end, is about expressing desire, not restraining it. If this is correct, and I believe it is, then the liberal democratic bargain, as I've defined it, is nothing but the modern means for fulfilling the inherent tendency of democracy itself. Abandoning this bargain, as I stated it at the beginning, would not bring about a more austere, steady-state democracy. It would mean the end of democracy and its replacement by systems of government that are bound to be worse. In the end, we have no choice but to make the best of the bargain, to do what we can to restore public support for the means most conducive in the long run to the ends they seek. In modern circumstances, therefore, economic growth and the wide sharing of the fruits of that growth is more than a material goal. It is a moral enterprise as well. The central question the West now faces is whether the next generation will again achieve broadly shared prosperity or rather experience stagnating, even declining living standards. Broad prosperity is the oil that lubricates the machinery of government and the glue that binds society together. Failing to achieve it would mean a continuation of our deadlocked, embittered politics and a turn away from the generosity that only peoples confident of their future can sustain. Thank you.